My name's Ash. I'm a consultant who works with heritage and cultural organisations on projects that normally involve some combination of strategic challenge, technology, audience needs, and organisational capacity. Today, we're going to talk about AI, but more specifically, we're going to look at practical applications of AI in heritage organisations. Now, this is part two. As Sarah said, we delivered part one a couple of weeks ago, and you can watch that back in full on the Heritage Pulse website. But before we sort of dive in today into today's bit, I just wanted to do a quick recap of where we got to last time, because I do think some of the ideas and concepts and principles that we covered are useful context and framing for what we're going to cover today. So last time, absolutely, I was saying that this wasn't an AI will transform everything session. It was about trying to start to think about where AI could be actually practically useful in heritage contexts, and then how we might begin to do that pragmatically and safely. And the headline question was sort of if AI was to answer, then what was the question? In other words, trying to encourage heritage organizations to not start with tools and then sort of run around looking for a problem that tool would solve, but instead to start with the task that you're trying to do and then think about how AI tools might be able to help. Because I think we need to think about how AI can be useful for us, maybe not think about it as a sort of magical solution for all of our challenges. And I shared Cory Doctorow's definition, which I think is useful because whilst it recognizes that some of these tools could be useful or very useful, it also highlights the importance of humans, workers, and the importance of those people making active decisions about how and when these tools are used. I also defined what I meant by AI. It's quite a sort of umbrella term. And we talk specifically about four flavors of AI you're perhaps most likely to meet. So generative AI was things like ChatGPT that help you maybe draft, rewrite, summarize. Um, Analysis AI tools, sort of helping spot patterns in audience data or feedback surveys. Recognition tools might help with transcription, image recognition, handwriting, and then automation tools can be plugged into workflows to help categorize, route things, trigger things. And as I said last time, and I want to sort of reiterate today, most of the valuable and useful applications of AI are pretty operational and should probably be pretty boring. That's fine. And I think that's probably where we should start. We also talked about hype. AI's had this big, this will change everything, this will cure cancer, this will end the world moment. And we're now in the phase where the tools that have been released, people have realized, they hallucinate, they need checking, they are biased, they don't plug neatly into existing infrastructure. That doesn't mean it's useless, but I think it means we have to be quite specific and thoughtful when we're working out how and where it can actually be valuable for us. And as Anil Dash puts it, these technologies absolutely have utility, but the absurd way they've been overhyped and the fact that they are being forced on people in some contexts sometimes makes it difficult to focus on the legitimate uses where they might add value. So to try and bring into focus those legitimate uses, I gave a set of principles to try and unpack how these tools work and behave. Because that's what we're trying to do today. We're trying to sort of look past the noise and start to focus on legitimate and grounded uses. Because as I said last time, AI is like an enthusiastic and confident intern. It's fast, it sounds really convincing, but it absolutely has to be checked and kept an eye on because it won't have all the context that you do. It's likely to have forgotten something important, and it might have made something up in an effort to please you. AI tools, fundamentally, on a sort of really basic level are about pattern matching rather than understanding. When you feed large documents into an AI tool, it doesn't read the whole thing in the way that a person might. It instead breaks that document down into chunks. And through that method, context can quite easily get lost. We talked about the fact that if you are feeding or applying AI tools to messy contexts, they will often scale that mess rather than solve it. We talked about the fact that it's probabilistic, not deterministic. So it's not a database. You're not always going to get the same answer twice. Although some experiments have shown that at scale, some responses from AI can become sort of strangely predictable. There was an example that was given for a number of different AI tools to pick a random number between 1 and 10. And the number of times they picked the answer 7 was disproportionately present. We talked about AI's working memory and how surprisingly short that is. So AI tools can only hold a certain number of words or tokens in its mind at any one time before earlier tokens start to get released. So when you're working with long or complex material, do not assume that the AI is remembering everything you have talked about with it. Be really ready to repeat, restate, or reattach important context. And you maybe need to treat it as if you're talking to a slightly forgetful colleague who's probably going to need reminding of some of the salient facts. We talked about how AI is a blending machine. It will often blend the specific context of whatever you're telling it or feeding it with its general training knowledge. And it sometimes adds filler to make the answers it's giving you sound smoother. So the example I gave was you might feed it catalog notes, but then it might mix in general knowledge gathered from the internet, which includes sources like Reddit. And so therefore it might mix in facts about an artist that are disputed or just outright inaccurate. And crucially, perhaps we talked about how automation shifts work. It evolves the work that needs to be doing. It doesn't erase it. So when you're maybe asking AI to draft emails for you, you move the work from writing to instead reviewing. And I think this matters for heritage context because we deal so often in nuance and sensitivity and interpretation. And so we always need to keep a human in the loop because these AI tools should not be thought of as replacements. They should be thought of as assistants. I think you absolutely still need humans for judgment, for ethics, for accountability. The example I gave was of autopilot. An autopilot can fly the plane steadily, but a human pilot has to be in control for takeoff, landing, and turbulence. And lastly, I talked about how AI models learn from vast amounts of internet text, which also means they absorb the biases, gaps, and assumptions that's baked into that content. And most of the training data that they've been trained on skews heavily Western, heavily Anglophonic, and typically towards dominant cultural narratives. And I talked about some research from academics at Harvard that have identified that the further someone's cultural distance from the US, the less correlated responses from something like ChatGPT are to their cultural values. We looked at the roles that AI could play. So you could maybe take the same tool and assign it different roles in different contexts. It could be a doer. You're asking it to sort these inquiries. It could be a summarizer where you're asking it to turn this 20-page policy into a briefing for our development team. It could be a sparring partner. Give me 5 ideas around this particular opportunity or challenge. Or it can be an outsourcer where you're asking it to do the whole thing, analyze the problem, write the response, send the response. But I said the red flag, absolutely the danger zone is treating it as the outsourcer because the research has shown that quite quickly starts to de-skill people. And it also starts to really flatten nuance. And in heritage, I think we're almost always going to want AI as a helper, not an outsourcer. So I think it's really important to be specific about the role that you're asking AI to play, and to also then think about what that means about the skills, judgment, and relationships that you're asking your people to hold. To make that practical, I gave you a two by two way of deciding where AI might be most appropriate and valuable to use. We sort of said that the low stakes and repetitive quadrant of this grid is perhaps the perfect place, the most valuable place for AI to be deployed. Whereas the high stakes and unique quadrant in the bottom right, that's probably where you do not want to take AI anywhere near. That's sort of human only zone. Low stakes and unique is perhaps safe to experiment. Um, I really tried to stress that AI at the moment, do not use it for high stakes, high context, or high nuance tasks. And I would really encourage all organizations, large and small, to have some kind of guiding policy so that staff and volunteers know what's expected. And that might be something as simple as, you say that we use AI for drafts and summaries. We won't use it for legal safeguarding, conservation or sensitive interpretation. We never upload personal or sensitive data, and we review with a person before anything goes to the public. And that starts to give people guardrails and also permission to be able to experiment without going completely rogue. And these were some of the things that a simple policy should cover. The purpose, the red lines, how you're going to handle data, how there's going to be human oversight, and how you're going to sort of pilot the experiment. As I said, if nothing exists already in your organization, I would really propose just a draft one-page AI use principles for your team. It absolutely doesn't need to be perfect. Start with simple, start with clear, and then improve it as you start to use these tools, because that will mean that you can experiment with AI with much more safety and much more confidence with your colleagues. And then finally, I showed you a simple seven-step way that you might want to start to think about how you run pilots and experiments with AI. So firstly, I said it works best in contexts where you can absolutely define every step of a process. If you cannot do that, do not put an AI into that context. Once you've defined the process, pick one step that the AI could help with, not the whole process, and then pick the role that you're asking the AI to play in that step. That then gives you some quite clear criteria where you can match the tool to the step, to the problem, to the challenge, to the task, rather than starting with a tool and trying to find a problem to solve with it. You absolutely need to think about ripple effects, think about second and third and fourth order impacts. What changes downstream if we use an AI to do this thing? You need to be very clear about how you're defining success. Is that about the amount of time saved? Do you need to be hitting a certain degree of accuracy? And what sort of consistency do you need to be ensuring? What sort of safeguards are you putting in place? Where is a human checking? Where are the sort of decision gates? How can you be sure that something's not just going to sort of charge ahead and cause havoc? And lastly, know where your data goes. Don't shove sensitive material into public tools. I gave the equivalent. If you wouldn't put it in a public Google Doc, don't put it into an AI tool. So that was what we covered last time. This time, I want to look at some practical examples. These are all initially hypothetical examples that felt relevant and practical. Examples of how AI usage might look in day-to-day heritage work. There are seven examples that I'm going to share where AI could play a role. And for each of those examples, I'm going to flag the potential gains, the potential risks, and then also which of the principles that I mentioned it's worth keeping in mind if you're starting to think about this application. So the first application is potentially around object data and descriptions. So that might look like you uploading images or documents into an AI tool and it generates draft labels, keywords, or summaries. So it might look at a photo and suggest wooden chair, likely 19th century, four legs, carved detail. Now, this could potentially really speed up the tagging of those objects, potentially increasing the capacity of the teams or the individuals doing that work. But there's a real risk that the content could be generic, it could be incorrect, or it could be culturally insensitive. Unless you put guidelines in place, the AI is not going to understand what is and isn't acceptable in your particular institutional collection context. And also, it's really important to understand, to remember the sort of principle of garbage in, garbage out. You know, if your catalog has gaps or errors, the AI is going to scale them. And as I said earlier, that sort of blending machine effect, it might mix in inaccurate or disputed facts. It's also worth mentioning here a note on copyright. If AI generates descriptions, image tags, or any other content, the legal status of that is still pretty murky. From the research that I've done, in most jurisdictions, AI generated content isn't copyrightable because it lacks human authorship. Now, this perhaps fine for internal workflows, but if you're publishing or licensing material, you might need to ensure that there is substantial human editing involved in order to establish copyright. And remember, if the AI was trained on copyrighted images or text, which almost all of the models are, using its output doesn't give you rights to the underlying material. Always look into that and attribute as you would normally, where possible. Now, the next example is around visitor service and visitor inquiries. So this could look like you taking all of your FAQs, your visitor guides, your visitor policies, and putting them into a chatbot platform. There's lots of these platform products out there. And as a result, visitors might can type a question into the platform and get a response, an AI generated response based on your content. Now, again, there could be a considerable gain here in that your visitor services staff are going to spend less time answering basic questions like when do you open? How much does the car park cost? Can I bring my dog? Um, but there is a risk that sensitive or urgent queries might get stuck. And as a result, visitors might feel fobbed off or really frustrated. Um, Also, it's important to remember this idea of chunking. AI doesn't see whole documents, only the chunks, those fragments. So it may miss or misconnect caveats or disclaimers. Guardrails are going to be really important. You're going to have to do a lot of testing for this implementation. And you're going to have really clear escalation mechanisms in place so that staff can quickly step in for complex or sensitive cases. So potentially big reward on capacity and removing friction from visitor service, but also significant risk to think about as well. So the next application is pretty internally focused. Document summarization for different audiences amongst your staff. So you might drop a really verbose call a funding opportunity and all of its attached criteria, or minutes from a meeting, or a new policy into an AI tool. Ask for it to produce a summary for different audiences or different departments, sort of calling out the key things that they need to be aware of from that opportunity or new area of compliance. Now, this can really quickly help colleagues understand what's relevant, but again, remembering context, limits, remembering chunking, nuance quite possibly gets lost, edge cases might vanish, and whilst the orientation can happen quite quickly, your colleagues are still going to need to likely engage with the detail. Summaries are absolutely helpful for sort of skimming, understanding, should I be paying this attention? But it's not a replacement for proper engagement with with the detail of what that document or that thing is telling you. So I think there's a number of applications, potential workflow automation applications in the back office. So that might be around an AI tool sorting incoming emails, ensuring that they're routed to the right team. Um, Taking regularly generated spreadsheets and helping to draft reports off the back of that. I've certainly spoken to people that have plugged some automation into how they're preparing their board reports. uh, you potentially do gain consistency here, and speed, and you possibly reduce bottlenecks if there's a reliance on one member of staff, or a volunteer, or someone who's part-time. Then this potentially helps to broaden the capacity around that structure. But so a lot of these automations are relatively easily confused. They don't deal well with surprises. If inputs change, then things can start to break. And also, I think you need to be really mindful about how you're designing this shift in process or shift in service. Because as I've said, automating something isn't going to make that work go away, it just shifts it. So if the staff are saving time on categorizing incoming emails, they're going to then maybe have to spend more time on sort of monitoring that automation and dealing with the categorized email. The work sort of shifts. So again, start small, test really carefully. Another obvious application is for data analysis and potential audience insights. This the scenario I was imagining was you might want to feed survey responses or photos of comment cards into an AI tool, and it will be able to cluster them into themes like parking issues or family activities or pricing. So there is a potentially massive gain on speed here, but AI is not good with sarcasm. They are not good with nuance. And there's a sort of a risk that minority voices or really important issues that have a smaller amount of representation are sort of eliminated from the analysis. And again, it's really important to understand that an AI is not understanding what you're feeding into it. It's matching patterns. So it's going to absolutely understand the volume of sentiment and the volume of word clusters, but it's not going to get meaning. And I would recommend you always follow up with human review. And certainly when I've done this sort of work as well, in every tool I've used, the AIs do hallucinate. There are some more, so when I say hallucinate, I mean make things up. There are some more research focused tools. I used a tool called Deduce, where that hallucination seems to have been dealt with. But just to flag, if you're doing data analysis, audience insights with these sorts of things, you're asking it to give you indicative quotes around a particular issue, there is a real danger that it's going to be making things up. So check, check, double check. Um, Content reuse and repurposing, I think, is a really nice potential usage. So that is, you're potentially taking a text and you're asking the AI tool to adapt it. That maybe looks like simplifying it for children aged 6 to 8, or shortening it for social media, or reframe it for teachers who are teaching this particular subject. Um, Now there's a sort of efficiency gain here. You're sort of using one set of information and you're repurposing it for multiple audiences. There's potentially an argument that you could say this is an accessibility application because you are being very specific about how that content can be framed and delivered to different audiences to meet their needs. But nuance, tone of voice, those can quite quickly sort of bleed out of the interpretation. Mistranslations can start to creep in. Um, Again, that idea that AI is a blending team, it's going a machine, it's going to reshape your words using general patterns in its training data. So always review. And I would say always have a person do a final pass before publishing. But there is absolutely a potential speed benefit here. And then lastly, sort of everyday office assistant type uses um, can triage incoming emails, could perhaps even draft initial replies. It could help draft internal documents, initial outlines, initial structures, have an initial go at updating our volunteer handbook. This is probably the usage that I engage with most often. It really, for me, removes that blank page problem. It's often much easier to disagree with and rework something that already exists than it is to come up with it from scratch sometimes. So it can save significant admin time. But to remember, this is also, all of the quirks of AI can be present here. It can miss detail, misunderstand detail, make things up if you're not giving it really, really clear context. And even then, you're going to have to check what it is outputting. As I say here, drafts can be really useful starting point, but you absolutely still want a person to be refining those and checking them before they get sent anywhere or published anywhere. And just to reiterate, across all seven examples, the automation is not making that work go away. It's shifting where the human work needs to happen. If an AI is drafting really quickly in a couple of seconds, 50 new object data records, archivists and curators might need to spend more time checking those 50 than if they'd written 10 carefully themselves. If AI is triaging emails, staff are still going to need to be keeping an eye so that they can quickly escalate or review particularly tricky or sensitive ones. So I think the question isn't, can we give this to AI to do? But if we use AI in this context, does that shift make the work genuinely easier, better, or faster? And what problem are we moving down the line? Now, I just thought I'd touch on three or four specific examples in heritage contexts. I sort of brushed over this one last time. So the Living Museum launched last year. It was an experimental web app by developer Jonathan Talmy, which used the British Museum's openly licensed collection data to let visitors build personalized exhibitions via natural language search. And it also allowed users to talk with artifacts in the British Museum's collection through LLM powered interface. And I think it was absolutely an interesting experiment. I think it demonstrates, creative use of AI for potential ideas around engagement, interpretation. I think if it had been framed as an experiment and if he'd maybe been more thoughtful about the nuances of um, the museum sector and the importance of interpretation and context, I think what this example really showed is that experimental work like this requires really clear labeling and really clear human review to avoid errors, bias, overconfidence in interpretive claims. And I would say that the reaction from the sector would indicate that Mr. Talmy possibly missed out on this step. The Living Museum was technically inventive. I think letting users search a collection with natural language search and talk with some artifacts is an interesting idea. But the project ran into really fierce criticism. And I think it's a good example of what happens when experimentation ignores some of the principles and basics that we've been talking about. This the main problem that people seem to have with this example application was around cultural sensitivity, around bias, because by ventriloquizing artifacts, as some people described it, and by making them speak in a pretty generic AI voice, the platform was actually reproducing some pretty colonial narratives, and it was stripping away a lot of nuance that would have existed in a much more human, culturally sensitive, culturally informed interpretation. And so I think this reflects some of the points I made earlier. AI mirrors its training data, including biases. And without really careful guardrails and framing, it risks reinforcing harmful perspectives and stereotypes. I think this project also really highlighted something around authenticity and trust. A lot of the reaction was from museum professionals worried that the project undermined curatorial expertise and flattened visitor experience into a sort of shallow chatbot style interaction. Um, and I think, as I've said, AI can absolutely sound convincing, but also perhaps miss some of the interpretive depth that makes cultural interpretation meaningful. That being said, some people, some users absolutely loved this implementation of AI. Um, and I think, again, if we think about what work would this have created if a museum had launched it rather than solving, instead of lightening the curatorial load, this tool would have created so much extra checking, the need for massive ethical oversight. It's sort of a very heritage specific example of the term AI slop that you've maybe come across. So while the project was creative, it fell into the trap of treating AI as a total outsourcer rather than one of the other roles that I mentioned earlier. The result wasn't, more meaningful connections with objects in the BM's collection, but a sort of wave of mistrust. And I think that shows that these experiments only work if they respect the context and the ethics and the expertise of the people and communities around them. Now, on the flip side, the London Museum launched what they called Clio 1.0 earlier this year. This was a conversational search agent that, on paper did some of the same things as the Living Museum example. It helped visitors explore its collections using natural language search. It gave some answers. However, unlike the Living Museum, it's grounded in trusted data and content. So the answers are only generated from the museum's own collections and the museum's own story content, which avoids that blending problem of mixing in content from mad unknown internet sources. There were some really clear guardrails that the team at the London Museum put in place. It doesn't attempt to ventriloquize objects. It only attempts to support discovery, and subjective or sort of existential, controversial questions are quite elegantly deflected, um, which I think preserves curatorial authority and authenticity. It's also, you can tell they've thought about ethics. It's sort of ethical by design. The project openly flags its limitations. So saying we have incomplete data, we can only give English responses. And it's committing to some inclusive standards around language. And also, there's an obvious awareness of the environmental impact of using AI tools. The London Museum chose a smaller, simpler, more task-specific model, and they excluded images from the responses that were returned. So they've deliberately reduced the load and the energy consumption that this tool is using. So I think it's much stronger than the Living Museum example because it's only working with sort of credible, curated data. It's complementing the work of curators rather than trying to replace them. And it avoids that outsourcer trap. It's sort of staying in that summarizer role. And it's treating AI as a navigation tool rather than an interpretive voice, which I think is more likely to maintain audience trust and sort of avoids that slop danger. So I think this is a nice example of not a hype experiment, but a pretty measured pilot that's balancing innovation with ethics, clarity, usefulness, and sustainability. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about a couple of visual arts organizations who I can't name, but I've spoken to recently who have deployed AI tooling to speed up workflows around things like image editing and upload. So a specific use case was around cropping the color bars out of object imagery and then image tagging and categorization. And one organization I spoke with had said this has increased the number of images that they were able to process and use by a factor of 10. So it's a really significant broadening of capacity. You know, they are able to do more of this work, or they are able to free people up to work on other things. So I just want to sort of, as I wrap up, come back to some of the essentials. Hopefully, no one on this call thinks it, but AI is not magic. It's automation and pattern matching in nicer packaging. I think in a heritage context, it's probably going to work best and most usefully and least stressfully in clear, repeatable, low stakes contexts. So those are things like sorting, summarizing, drafting. I think maybe the golden rule is if you want to put it into a process, you have to be able to define the process first. Then you want to test really small and always ensure that you're keeping that human oversight in place. And just lastly, I want to talk a bit about what I've observed with the AI tools that I've used, what they're good at, what they're less good at. So ChatGPT, perhaps the most well-known one. It's a sort of it does the most things maybe out of so it can generate images, it can analyze data, it can brainstorm, summarize, etc. However, and I find it really good for first drafts, really good for from X perspective, what am I missing? Um, but it hallucinates, it makes things up. It's still, there is that sycophancy problem. It is designed to give you answers that it thinks you will like rather than the most useful answer or the most correct answer. And that is, I think, maybe most present in ChatGPT. So Claude is a similar tool from Anthropic. I've found that Claude is particularly strong when it comes to giving feedback on existing long documents. So it seems that its working memory is larger than ChatGPT's. I also prefer the tone of Claude. It's more like dealing with a quite straightforward colleague who's giving you quite clear, unambiguous feedback, explaining how they've got there and not sort of massaging your ego. But it's still absolutely probabilistic. I found it's less great at generating first drafts, sometimes has a tendency to oversimplify in that context. Um, so the Microsoft Copilot tool, which is built into all of Microsoft's sort of Office suite, is really good for everyday admin if you're already using the 365 sort of ecosystem. So drafting emails, summarizing meetings, quick analysis of spreadsheets. Again, though, all of those usages are going to depend on how good your ingredients are. If you have poorly structured data, chaotic document structures, things living all over the place, its applications are going to be less useful. Google Workplace AI seems to be quite good at very, very low stakes, very simple applications. Really, really high level, I would say surface level. It's not good for complex tasks. Um, I have experienced, and I've spoken to a number of other people who have experienced significant hallucinations when you're doing analysis with it in Google Sheets, for example. And then lastly, just a few examples of specialist tools, because as I said earlier, I think AI is most useful when you can be really specific about what you're using it for. And yes, some of the more general tools like ChatGPT or Claude are maybe good sort of jack of all trades, Swiss Army knives. But often and increasingly, there are very specific tools available for very specific use cases. So those are things like Descript, which I've used for video editing, Granola, terrible name, but for taking meeting notes. And I found that's the best tool I've used for transcribing meetings, taking meeting notes, giving you useful actions at the end of a meeting. Scribe can be really good for capturing a workflow. So I've used it to explain some things to people. I've seen also a couple of organizations I work with have started trialing it with their onboarding for new staff. Um, because I think these very niche, very practical tasks are where AI can be really useful, but they are not replacing sort of the work. I think they still need proper checking. Think of them as something that is maybe accelerating that work, making it able to happen faster, but not, you don't want to be giving it all the control and sort of totally outsourcing. So as I've said, I think use these tools for things where you can speed things up. They're good for routine tasks. They're good for drafting. Do not rely on them for facts. Do not rely on them for nuance. Anything sensitive, get an expert to at least do a final check on that. Um, and I just to reiterate this question again, is it making the work genuinely easier, better, or faster? Because in some applications, these AI tools feel very like you're being productive, but actually the quality of what they're producing is pretty rubbish. So I would just encourage you to always have a slightly critical eye on any outputs that you're given. If you're interested in this stuff, here are a few names of people who I think are doing good work. So Jocelyn is a sort of AI expert, and she also leads workshops specializing in specifically helping heritage and cultural organizations think about how they might apply AI. It takes a very sort of playful and creative approach. Tay Bannerman is a VP at McKinsey, which maybe makes you go yuck, but actually I think he's doing some really good work and sharing some really good thinking around cultural context and AI applications grounded in actual human needs. Cory Doctorow, I referenced earlier, he's a sort of author and activist and healthy skeptic of these things. Rachel Caldercutt is a strategist and researcher on responsible tech, perhaps best known for her work on ethical design and digital inclusion. She's doing a lot of work on sort of public interest technology. Um, Ed Zitron is an absolutely scathing critic of big tech and AI. He has a newsletter. He publishes regularly very articulate screeds about why this is all terrible. Um, Ethan Mollick is an associate professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He also has a newsletter. He focuses on how AI is reshaping work and education. And lastly, Temi is the exec director of Glitch, which is a charity that campaigns for ethical, equitable, and just technologies. And Temi is also a writer and researcher exploring AI, culture, and identity with a focus on how marginalized voices are represented in emerging technologies.